All right. All right. Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Trumais Pedig Beis Halacha Beis. We're learning today Daf Chav Gimel. We left off on Daf Chav Beis Amid Beis, 2 lines before the bottom of the Amid, beginning with the Gemara. The Mishnah taught us the rule that we are already familiar with, that ein toidemin mimin al she'enoi minoi. That when you separate Truma, even though you have two piles that are equally tevel from the same year, but if it's one type and that the other one is from another type, you cannot separate trumos, and really trumos and maisris one on the other. We're going to begin today's daf by quoting the source from which we learned this halacha, and then we're going to spend the rest of the daf with the following. When the Mishnah spoke about two different types, the Mishnah actually spoke about that which appears to be different, but they are considered the same. And one of the examples the Mishnah gave was when you have figs, you have fresh figs called te'enim, you have what we call groigeris or groigeres, and that would mean pressed, dried figs. Then you have devela. Devela is those pressed cakes of figs. But let's focus on the fresh and on the dry. The fresh have a bigger volume. They're bigger. The dry is the same one, but it's smaller. The Mishnah says that you are allowed to separate trumos and maisris one on the other because it's considered the same min. Question now will be, and Aviv, you hit it on the nail yesterday when you began to think about how do we separate trumas from maisris. The two options will be volume. The other option will be number. So without getting into all of the nuance, just to give one of the details we'll get into, think about it. If I have 10 and 10, 10 fresh, 10 dried, the 10 fresh have a much bigger volume, right? The 10 dried have a much smaller volume. If I will be allowed to separate, let's say, from the dry on the fresh by using number, then let's say the kohen will end up losing. He'll get the right number, right? From every 100, he'll get 2, but he'll get small ones instead of getting big ones. The solution would be to say that if you're giving from, let's say, small on big or dry on fresh, you should give it by volume. Once you give by volume, whether it's the 2% by volume, whether it's the 10% meiser by volume, you resolve that. So there's really a machloikes tanoim, as we'll see. We're going to have a Tana Rabbi Yossi that says, I'm just giving this one example. We're going to learn other cases in the opposite. But if you're giving from dry on fresh, the Tana Rabbi Yossi says you can give by number. And in the Gemara, there's going to be a machloikes amoyroyim as to what's the reason behind the Tana Rabbi Yossi. One reason will be simple, that Rabbi Yossi holds that you always give it by number. Doesn't matter that the coin will get a smaller volume. You're doing what God said. The only thing is number. Other Amoyroyim, the Amoyre Rabbi Yossi, the Amoyre Rabbi Yoina explains the Tana Rabbi Yossi that even when something is shriveled, since it was fresh and large, perhaps it might go back to that state. I'm saying that perhaps because there'll be a lot of nuance in today's Gemara. So maybe you look at it as it was. Maybe you look at things now as they will be. And if that would be the case, then dry and fresh are now already viewed as to have the same volume.
Just add water.
Just add water. And because of this discussion, we're going to conclude today's daf by going into a Mishnah in Mesechtes Taros, exactly what Kevan mentioned. The topic over there is about food. And as we learned that for food to be able to impart tuma, it has to have the size of a kibetza of an egg. What happens if you had food that had that size, and therefore not only was it tummy, but it was able to convey tuma, and then it shriveled up? So the Mishnah says it no longer could convey tuma. But what happens if you added water, if it's soaked in water, and now it's plump again, now it's large again? So we're going to actually have two ways of understanding that Mishnah that we're going to correlate to these two ways of understanding the Tana Rabbi Yossi, all coming back, all based on the rule of the Mishnah that figs are figs. I don't care if they're white or black. I don't care if they're fresh or whether they're dried or whether they're pressed. They are considered the same min, and you could be toidem and ma'ased from one on the other. This is a kitzur of today's daf. Yes.
So during the dry phase on the regular phase, it doesn't seem like who cares about the volume? It's still the same volume of actual food. The fresh fig just have more water, and also you can even argue that the dry figs are better than the fresh figs because you can save them for longer.
Okay, I just want to repeat for those who didn't hear. Aviv made two good points. Point number one is just who said that dry is smaller in volume than fresh, when that which counts, which is the fruit, it's the same volume of fruit. It lost its liquid. Also, not to forget that the topic of dry versus fresh, there is something that dry has that's advantageous, better than fresh, and that is that it's miskayim, that it has a longer shelf life. We already learned about that. Point well taken, and we're going to come back to what we learned in Gemara. Okay, let's begin. In the bottom of Daf Chav Beis, first of all, this rule that the Mishnah gave, that ein toidemin mimin al she'enoi minoi, and I know that we're using the words of the Mishnah, ein toidemin chevre, it's the same by maisid. It's as if the Mishnah would have written, ein toidemin uma asrin. So says Rabbi Yochanan in the name of Rabbi Yanai, ze echad mishloisha midrashois shehein mechuvarim b'toidam, that the following source is going to be one of the three types of sources that is so clear that it is as if it was written explicitly in the Torah. We had this expression on Daf Yud Aleph Amid Beis, and I'm not going to go back to the whole thing, but I will read on Daf Yud Aleph Amid Beis in the Rashirilio, 6 lines from the top on the left column. So the Rashirilio says that Shloisha Mikrois Michuvarim Be'inyan Truma. It's not like from the entire Torah Shebal Peh, there's only three sources that's so clear, it's as if it was written explicit, and these are one of them. No. That in the halachos of Trumais, where we have so many things that we learn from the scripture, 3 of them are considered as if it was written explicit. That's all the Rashi Elio adds. It's not in the whole Torah, but b'negeya dinim of Truma, this is one of the 3. In other words, this is considered almost as if it's written explicit. Daf Chav Gimel Amud Aleph. What's the source? In Parshas Koirach, when the Torah again is speaking about the obligation on the Levi to separate from his Meiser Rishon, to separate Maser min HaMeiser, Trumas Meiser, 10% from his 10%. So says the Torah that Koil Chelev Yitzor, that the Levi should separate all of the best of the oil. In other words, what the Levi is separating is Truma. From what? From oil. Chelev, as we mentioned many times, not Negeya right now, is the explicit words that the Torah uses to tell us that we should separate from the best of what we have. That's the meaning of Chelev. But the Torah says, Koil Chelev Yitzor, from the best, Yitzor means from oil. And in the same pasuk, V'chol Chelev Tirosh V'Dagan. And from the best, Tirosh is wine, and Dagan is grain. And let me ask you a question. Why, Aviv, did the Torah have to write the word Chelev twice? The Torah could have written Koil, Chelev, Yitzor, Tirosh, V'Dagan. The fact that the Torah writes the word Chelev once for Yitzor, oil, and another time the same word Chelev for Tirosh, for wine, what does that show you? That wine and oil, even though wine and oil both come from fruits, nevertheless, this is wine, grapes, this is oil, olives. It's 2 different types, and the Torah uses the extra word to separate one from the other.
So does that mean that wine and grain can be separated from each other?
Let me ask even better. The problem with this explicit proof is that the same that proves, the same disproves. If the Torah writes Chelev twice to separate one type from the other, very good. So then either write Kol Chelev Yitzar, V'chol Chelev Tirosh, V'chol Chelev Dagan, or don't even mention Dagan. In other words, there is a problem with this. It's a great proof, and it's a great problem. And the Gemara doesn't have to speak it out because it expects us a higher standard that we should right away realize how problematic this limud is. And all the Gemara says is, Manan Kaiman, how do you resolve this contradiction? On one hand, it's a proof that you separate Yitzhak from Chalev. On the other hand, or Aviv worded it like this, why don't you say that Tirosh and Dagan could be, you could separate one from the other? Can't be that way. No, it undoes you're doing it and you're undoing it. How do you work that out? And the words of the Gemara, Im lalamed shehein tormim min atirosh ala dagan. Chalev separates, so Chalev unites. The Torah writes Chalev, Tirosh, v'dagan. So does that mean, Aviv, very good, that you can be Torah from Tirosh and Dagan? Or, and, umin hadagan ala Tirosh? That can't be. Why can that not be? So a guy will answer, yeah. You know what? Let's go with what it says. Yitzar and oil and wine have to be separated. But wine and Dagan could be one on the other. Doesn't make sense. Because wine and oil, like we mentioned, wine and oil both come from a fruit. Fruit has, let's say, the same bracha by the priya eitz. And even if fruit products, we don't say all the fruits are the same, we separate the wine from the oil, then for sure, tirosh and dagan, fruit from the ground. For sure, they should not be combined one with the other. Hativain, tiva means, how can that be? Hare tirosh ve'yitzod, hare shnei minei ilan. And yet, because of the Torah's repetition of the word chalev twice, so from there we learn ein Torahmin, and here the Gemara adds, v'loy ma'asrin mizal zeh. You got a problem that put a question mark, and let's learn the way the Pnei Moshe learns. Now answers the Gemara, Du Amar says the Pnei Moshe, Muzmin Zagin, the Al Karchach, the Hachi, Kamar Kram. Now what? First of all, Ma Tirosh v'Yitzar. First, let's go in the order of the pasuk. The Torah mentions Chalev Yitzar, Chalev Tirosh. Before you read the word Dagan, the question is, why didn't you write Kol Chalev Yitzar v'Tirosh? That's the first question. The answer is to teach you that you separate one from the other. One might have thought that there was something unique about Tirosh and Yitzar, that they should be separated. Maybe only by Tirosh and Yitzar. Maybe when it comes to grains, maybe they can all be combined. All the grains are the same. You might have said that. So the Torah puts together Tirosh and Dagan, and this is called the Binyan Av, to tell you that the same rule that we have, which is that Tirosh and Yitzar have to be separated, you cannot combine their that rule now applied to Dagan. Beautiful. Read it inside. Ma Tirosh v'Yitzar shehein miyuchadim shehein shnei minei ilan, even though they are both from trees, which, by the way, grains are from the ground. If you were to munch on grains, you would make a boire pri hadama, all equal. When you prepare it properly, you make the same mizoinus, you make the same hamoitzi. In other words, it's a great comparison that just like Tirosh and Yitzar, even though they both come from trees, nevertheless, ein tormin v'loy ma'atzim izel zeh. So now what Hashem does is, Hashem wants to tell you this rule applied to all other types also. Af va'af animar b'shnei minish b'dagan. Or really, even though the Torah only uses the words Dagan, but once we apply the separation of Yitzar and Tirosh to Dagan, one Dagan from the other, now we already learned for all other two types, which will be Shnei Minim Shabbat. We're talking about legumes, beans, lentils, which you taka make a hadama always. That in all of these, she'ein tormin v'lei ma'asrim mizeh al zeh. And all of this is considered explicit. You got to love that. I want to just mention on the side, we mentioned this when we opened up the Masechta. We mentioned this on occasion, that there is a three-way machloikes rishonim as to what exactly has to be tithed biblically. I'm not talking about from where from the land of Israel, and we learned a lot also in the last Masechta. There has to be Kedusha there. The whole topic of whether the Trumas U'Maiser is now is Doiraisa, the Rabbanan. I'm not going in that direction. I'm asking what type of produce has to be tithed. So you should know that from this pasuk, the pasuk mentions explicitly Yitzar, Tirosh, and Dagan. So what are these three? Oil, wine, and grain. Which is why some of the Rishonim hold that these are the only three types from which you have to separate Trumas U'Maisros. And by the way, when it comes to the oil and the wine, in that itself, there's a machlekes Rishonim. Clearly, oil and wine have to be tithed biblically. The question is, when the Torah speaks about oil, does it also mean olives? Not olives that are meant to be pressed, no, olives that are meant to be eaten. Even tirosh means wine. Does that include grapes? So that's another nuance. The Rambam, who is the most, let's say, machmer, holds that even though the Torah only mentions Yitzhar, Tirosh, and Dagan, but really that is a limud, and you can even say it's from our Gemara, because the Gemara is comparing Dagan and Tvua. Well, when I take that back, that all fruits, according to the Rambam, have to be tithed midorais. All fruits and grains. L'kula alma, according to all, vegetables only have to be tithed midrabanan. But all of that discussion comes from this pasuk that mentions these three, Yitzar, Tirosh, and Dagan. Okay. Says the Gemara, referring back to the Mishnah, that kol min chitim echad, and I stand corrected what I said. Min chitim means not the 5 grains you can tithe one from the other. Dafka not. Wheat, there are 5 types: wheat, barley, spelt, oat, and rye. Wheat really includes spelt, but all types of wheats can be tithed one for the other. And the Gemara extends it. Lochein tzericha, you know how far we extend. You have to understand how, you have to understand products. That afilu mi igdon al shamtis. Igdon refers to a white wheat. Shamtis, or the way it's written over here in the Marafulda, shamusis, it means a certain type of red wheat. Here, one would have thought even the color is different. It might be already considered different types. We don't say that. It's the same type. And in either direction, umin shamtis al igdun. I want to add another detail. The Gemara went in both directions because if one would have been clearly superior to the other, then you would only be allowed to be toidim from the superior on the inferior. So the Gemara is just being maramas with that also. They're both considered, they're different but equal, and they're different. And nevertheless, since they are all under the category of wheat, that you can be toidim and ma'asad one on the other. Okay. And now we begin the topic that's going to lead us to the end of today's daf. When the Mishnah gave an example of 1 min, so says the Mishnah that kol min te'enim. All types of te'enim are fresh figs. Groigeres or groigeres are dried figs, which was the common practice then in order to preserve them. The vela was their technique of pressing many figs into some sort of cake, a cake of pressed figs. Each one is different than the other. Nevertheless, since they are all figs, not only if they are white and black, but even if they're different now, nevertheless, they're still considered 1 min. This is quoting the Mishnah, and therefore, v'toyremin mizeh al zeh. And now, what's the issue? The issue is, okay, let's focus on Truma, approximately 2%. Let's focus on Maisid, exactly 10%. Do you separate it by number or do you separate it by volume? Even though we mentioned until now a general correct approach, which would be, well, how is this product commercialized? If it's commercialized by number, you're tied them by number. If it's commercialized by volume, by the way, volume can mean 2 things. When I say the word volume can mean, let's say you have a heap that has a certain height, or volume can mean weight, whichever one. We're not getting now into that detail. We're just going to make it into 2. Sometimes Chazal go into the 3. It's not negay right now. So again, normally, do it the way you commercialize it. That, according to some Tanoim, will not work over here. Why not? Because a pressed fig is smaller than a fresh fig. I ask Saviv, the fruit itself is not smaller. It's only a water difference. We don't look at it that way. It must be we don't look at it that way. We look at it as to be something superior and different and better. V'haraya, what did the Mishnah tell us, Aviv? That if the coin is available, then b'chlal, when it comes to if the coin is available, then you have to give from fresh. That's the yafa, right? That's the yafa. Why is it yafa? It's the same. It's not the same. So the solution is volume. If you're giving from small and big, because then you're giving the coin the same volume. If you're giving the coin by number, then that which is smaller, if he's only going to get 2, but he's going to get 2 little ones, for big ones, he's going to lose out. And the same is in the reverse. If you are giving from big on little, if you demand giving number, then the coin is going to benefit. If you allow to give volume, then you would end up giving less numbers, which has the same volume. The coin wouldn't lose, but neither would the owner claim that he's giving more than he has to give. You got it? Let's read it inside. Huh? Yes?
It all makes sense in my head, Shula. Right? Where you're saying, hey, we don't want the coin to lose out, so whatever, we'll do the volume on the direction that's favorable, right? What about Truma Smash when it has to be exact?
Same thing. God says give 10%.
Yeah.
Do we understand that what Hashem wants is for us to give it via number, by the figs? And if I have, me, Levi, if I have 100 figs, 50 of them are fresh, 50 of them are dry, am I allowed to get away by giving to the kohen 10 dried figs? And one might argue, maybe not. Because the coin is getting 10% in number, but he's not getting 10% of volume. Or let me go in the other direction, Danny. By Maisid, you can't give more than 10%. If what Hashem wants is for me to give number, then if I were to give the coin volume, he might end up getting more than 10 figs. And I'm not supposed to give more than 10%. Let's read it inside.
I'm saying these two measurements.
Yes.
They conflict one another.
Yes, they don't conflict. They're different.
No, whichever is most advantageous.
Let's see. Let's go read it. Tony, we learned. Very good. We're going to get to the emes right now. Tony, we learned in a Braisa. Now, there's a Tanakama that makes a statement, Chevra, and then we're going to have 2 Tanoim that argue with him. But it's one Tana argues with the first statement, and the second Tana argues with the Tanakama's second statement. And now you got it. Tanakama says, Toidemin te'enim ala groigris, you are allowed to separate fresh for dry. Okay. Meaning when you give fresh for dry, you give it by number. What happens over here? You make sure that the coin benefits. The coin gets even more. If where you're giving from fresh to dry, if you would give it by volume, Aviv, how many figs would he get? Less than he would get if you would give it to him by number. So the Tanakama says that in whichever direction you're going, you have to make sure that the coin gets the most. So if you're giving from fresh to dry, don't say, whoa, I'm giving him larger ones, so maybe I don't have to give the correct number. Maybe I'll just give it by volume. No, give it by number. And if you are going from groigeris al te'enim, and if you are going from dried to fresh, so you'll say, okay, let me be consistent. Like, what's the emes? If God wants me to give it by the number, so then let me go to Danny's case. Let's go to exact. I'm a Levi. I have 100 figs. Half are dry, half are fresh. I'm going to be giving all of them from the groigeris, from the dried. If I were to be allowed to give it by number, I will count 10. You got 10? No, Here you can't give it because he's going to be getting less volume. So whichever direction works better for the kohen, says the Tanakama, you have to give it. Ugreigeres alatem b'mida. And the Tanakama speaks out the other direction. It's the same thing. Avo loy te'enim ala greigeres b'mida. Don't separate if you're doing it from fresh on dry. Don't downgrade the number by saying, I'm only going to give the volume. You're going to give the right volume, but he's going to get a lesser number. If I'm going to give 10, if I'm going to give, let's say 8 fresh, in volume, the 8 fresh could be 10% from the 100. Tanakama says you can't do that. Give what's better for the kohen. Very simple. At least he's consistent. Not in volume, not a number. Consistent that whenever there are two options, now that we know you could be toidim from fresh and dry, and from dry and fresh, make sure that use the type that will give the kohen more and not less. It's like a certain psychology. You're giving a gift, give a great gift. Don't look to minimize your gift. Look to maximize your gift.
But another difference another difference between fresh and dried is it's water plus time, because the corn is going to lose time to make it the same. It's the dried fig will add time.
Well, that's okay. First of all, Kevin is going back to when we learned about Gezel HaShevet. We don't want to rob the coin from time, but right. Who says the coin wants to dry it? Maybe there's an advantage of having fresh. Persian loves dried fruits. So
or vice versa.
So the Mishnah was not written by Persians because the Mishnah's premise was that fresh is better than dry, with all due respect to the Persians.
No, of course.
All right, good. Now we're going to have two Tanoim. They both argue with the Tanakama, but each one is only focusing on one of the cases. So Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Oimer, that when you have a basket, and I want to say it's meduyik why he mentions a basket. Baskets is a volume. Again, volume, don't confuse. Volume could be a basket, can be weight. They're both in the volume. So Sale te'enim ugreigeres. If you have baskets, and they have these two types again, and he's speaking about fresh and dry, says the Tanakama, toirimim uma asrim mizeh al zeh, even though Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel doesn't make mention explicitly, Danny, of volume or number, again, since he mentions saleh, that's the way we understand. What he's saying is that you always give it by volume. There's always give it by volume. So he's actually going to agree with the Tanakama in the case when you're giving dry very good on te'enim, he's masking. You give it by volume. Where does he disagree? He disagrees when you're toidim from te'enim on greigeres. The Tanakama says you got to give it b'minyan for the coin to get even more. He says you don't have to give the coin even more. You give it by volume.
Case where Mishnah told us that ideally you always give fresh, right? The coin sort of loses out there if it's fresh and dry.
Again, you're saying what Kate, I agree. You're saying what Kate. In other words, the Mishnah already made it clear. The only justification to give dry is when there's no kohen benimso. Okay. Now, Omar Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Rabbi Yosi, and really, even though it's Rabbi Shmuel, we're going to call this the Tana Rabbi Yosi because he's telling you what his father did. That Abba, mein Tate, Rabbi Yosi, the Tana Rabbi Yosi, hoyonoitel eser groigeres min amukza. That when he had 100 figs, he would allow, listen to this, to give, not 50-50, he's giving the most extreme case. He had 90 te'enim, 90. He had 10 dry. He would give it by number. So what would he give? He would get away by giving 10 dried, and he would keep for himself the 90 fresh. In other words, what he says, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says you only give it by volume. the Tana Rabbi Yossi says you only give it b'minyan. You give it by number. And even in the most extreme case where the coin will end up with the least, the coin will say, you're kidding, I have 10% from Nisano's thing over there. And what did he get? He got 10, shkoyach. But he got 10 little shriveled up nothings, and the Levi kept for himself 9 plump, groise, like selfish. No, that's the way you do it. Because we're speaking about giving Trumas Meiser from a Levi. That's what we're talking about.
Rabbi.
L'chura, either Rabbi Yossi was a Levi, or that was just the example that he gave. He wanted to make it clear that even if you have 100, 90 and 10, I get 50, 90 and 10, he would give the 10 dry, and he would keep the 90 for himself.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Sorry, doesn't this make it kind of a subjective argument, meaning it really, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. You consider dry bad, okay, but somebody else considers them good. So I think giving numbers seems to make sense.
You made a good point. Aviv made this point. Danny made this point. Keva made this point. You're right. We're not debating. We see from our Chazal over here that we don't say that. We see here that we look at an objective benefit of fresh versus dry, compounded with that we want the coin to get the greatest gift. Greatest in size. In other words, the whole premise, okay, Vlad, I'm wording what you're asking. I don't have an answer. You're making an observation that if the fact that the Tanakama's premise is we want the coin to get the best, the biggest. And what's the best and the biggest? Begashmias. If the biggest is volume, he should get volume. If the biggest is number, he should get number. Tanakama. Vlad is saying, who says that's the best and the biggest? Point well taken. The Tanakama thinks that's the way it is.
You're not saying. Sometimes we look at things depending on how that item.
I just said that it's commercialized. We don't say it by figs. Right. Interesting. So I'm saying we're not saying it by figs over here.
Go by that.
Because here, based on this premise that we want for the coin to get the most, we don't want the coin to be cheated out of his 2%, or out of his 10%.
But Rashbag and Rabbi Yossi are not saying that it goes by that.
Rashbag says consistent volume. Rabbi Yossi says consistent number.
So does that mean that we're going to the first Tanakama? Our goal is to always give the most.
Yep.
In every category.
Yes. And most you see doesn't mean subjective. It means the biggest. If volume is more, it's more.
Okay. So in every category, the goal is to give the most, whatever it is.
Yes. Okay, now we're going to only focus on Rabbi Yossi. And there are two different ways of understanding the Tana Rabbi Yossi. Ironically, not to get confused, the first, Chav Gimel Amud Beis, is we're gonna have a Rabbi Yossi here also. So Rabbi Yirmiyah Savar Meimar, that what's the rationale behind the Tana Rabbi Yossi that he says that when you give from dried for fresh, you give by number, not because he doesn't care about the volume. No. Because ato roye es atzamek ki ilu tofeach. Because halachically, when you look at the dried fig, see now it's a halachic concept. The dried fig began as a swollen one, right? It began large. Elamah dried out. So really, Rabbi Yossi also wants for you to give to the kohen the right volume, approximately 2% of volume, exactly 10% of volume. Elamah, he says that halachically, dried and swollen are viewed to be the same. Look inside the top marafulda. Rabbi Yirmiyah Savar Meimar, that had the Torim Rabbi Yossi, groigeres negate'enim, right, dried for the fresh. B'minyan with number hainu taima sha'anu roim hagroigeres shehem tzamuk hashta. Even though now it's tzamuk, right? Now it's shriveled up. Ki'ilu hein tofeach. Why? Because you look at the way things used to be. It means when you look at someone, you can see them as they were. You know how common it was that when you interact with a Yid that's currently not that connected, you remind him how his Zayda was, who knows, the great mashpi over there in Neville. And what you do is that you go back to the source, you bring out the source in the current. The im kain, the marafulda, im nishar b'mida hate'enim. Shenotal Rabbi Yossi neged elu groigeres. Even if you're going to use midah, it's not that Rabbi Yossi is saying we just go by number. No, Rabbi Yossi agrees with Rashbag. Really, you give it by volume. He's saying that when you give this coin, the 10 little shriveled up nothings for the 90 plump that you're keeping from yourself, we look at it halachically that you're giving the same volume. You know, when we say royin ki'ilu, kol haro'ui lebila, so it can be future tense. And here, interestingly, we're going on the past. Since it used to be, when you look at your child and he made a mistake, you got to look at him the way he used to be when he was 2 years old. Or 1 year old, depends. So many people's kids, when they're 2, they're already challenging. Not mine. Now, unisav salin kamod inun. In other words, Rabbi Yossi, who kept for himself, what we were saying, he kept for himself 90. Not that he kept for himself 90. The volume that he kept for himself are equivalent to the volume that he gave to the kohen. That's Gavaldik. Now, that's a stretch. But that's what Rabbi Yirmiyah understood, Bishitas Rabbi Yossi. On the other hand, both the Amoyre Rabbi Yoina and the Amoyre Rabbi Yossi, don't confuse. Tarvayin Amrin, that we don't go to the past. This is very important. We, if anything, I agree that many times when you look at something, you should see in it Chacham Roya es Hanoiled. You should see what it will be. Something that's fresh could be looked as if it's already dried out. But something that's dried doesn't get re-swollen, with all due respect to Kevan that spoke about the soaking it in water, not over here. In other words, if you were to take your pressed, dried fig and put it in water, it's not going to go back. Whoever saw the picture, that nice purple plum fruit, ain't going back to that. Rehydrated. Go take an old man, put you in the mikvahs, but the garnish shelf and chevre. We're all shriveled up. So derech hatofeyach is litzmoik. Something that's, that I agree. We go to the future, you don't go to the past. There are many other ways of understanding it. But since ve'ein derech hatzomek litpoyach, it cannot be that Rabbi Yossi is saying that when you look at the 10 shriveled up dried figs that he gave to the kohen, he's looking at it as if it had the same volume. That cannot be. You cannot look at it that way. It's not going in that direction. Eloma, Rabbi Yossi, the Tana Rabbi Yossi must hold that when Hashem told us to be Toidem Uma'asid, what we need to do is number. That's it. The coin doesn't have to get the most. I don't care about what he gets. I have to separate number. Unesaf Salan Ravravin B'te'inayo. So if it's by number, I'm a chaya. So I have 10 baskets, let's say. I gave him 1 basket. I gave him the right number. What I ended up keeping for myself is something that has greater volume, doesn't matter. Amaloin Rav Acham, Kain, Rabbi Ila Rabchain, Haveba, that when Rabbi Ila, your teacher, when he heard Rabbi Yirmiyah's statement that Rabbi Yirmiyah was Savar Meimer Pshat in the Tana Rabbi Yossi, his words, Atoroya esat samek, ki'ilu tofeyach, you look at something that's already shriveled up as if it's swollen, he says it can't be. He said, I would accept if someone were to look at something fresh as if it's already shrunken, that I would accept. Because it's going in that direction. So you can see the noilad in the present. But to see the past in the present, they disagreed with that. Okay.
I say in my mind, I struggle with that first opinion because according to that, the opinion of number really is volume. So that means, let's say I had all different size apples. I can't just take 10 apples and say, okay, that's my 10 apples. Because now you have to actually say, wait, if this one's bigger, that one's smaller, I need my 10% of volume.
Danny, we learned about this and 2 Masechtas ago, and we're going to come back to this. We struggled with that.
Number, take 10 apples for 90 or whatever.
I would say one thing, that Danny is making a correlation that is very logical, but that's not what we are talking about. Danny is talking about 2 figs, they're all fresh. One happens to be bigger than the other. I know it's a similar topic. Here we're speaking about even if the figs started out to be exactly the same size and the same volume, now some of them dried out.
Rabbi, don't we use value?
So again, before learning the sugya, a simplistic way, which is not accurate, general, is that how do you tithe it? Depending how it's commercialized. But evidently, we're not going over here in this direction. There's a lot more pieces that we have to put together. This is a great topic. This is very deep. I want to know the emes. When you look at a person, I would even argue that most people are not chachamim. They are unable to see the future. All they see when they look at a person is they see the sum total of everything that they did. They see the past. Because I understand what Rabbi Yirmi is saying.
You look at the value of something, how it will raise up in the future. It'll go up. You buy it low, you sell
You're
it
a chacham. I'm talking about when you look at your kids, and your kids are misbehaving. When you want to see their righteousness, what are you thinking about? Are you thinking about your fantasy of how they will look? Or are you thinking about how great they used to be? It's much easier the past already happened. Anyways, let's go weiter. And now we're not going to conclude the whole thing today, but let's begin. And like we mentioned, we're going now to Masechtas Taharos. In Seder Taharos, there's a Masechta called Masechta Taharos. And over there we learned that number 1, that Kebeitza Oichalin, concerning the rule, that when it comes to imparting Tumah, according to some Rishonim, even acquiring Tumah, by food, the food needs to have the minimum shear of a Kebeitza. So let's go, guys. You have food that has the amount of a kibetza that is already tameh. Now, with others, whatever the other is, it was a kibetza. But now, since, just as an example, you left it in the sun, and vinismatu, and now it shrunk. And by the way, it's not only by tumas oicholin, for which you have to have a kibetza, the kazayis min anavela. Right, a kazayis, a nevela is metama bemaga ubemasa, but you have to have a kazayis amount. I have a kazayis amount of a nevela, but I left it in the sun and it shrunk. Or ka'adasha, the lentil volume of any one of the shmoina shiratzim that's dead, that can be metame. Again, you have to have the size of a lentil. I have that, and now it shrunk. And now one other topic that's already a little bit a stretch. You see, Kazayas Pigul, Kazayas Noiser, Kazayas Chalev, I want you to know that Pigul and Noiser are Metama Yadayim. There's really a Machloikas Rishonim, not that Negea right now, whether it's Metama or Yadayim in the size of a Kebetza or in the size of a Kazayas. In addition to that, Danny, the Iker, you see, when Pigul and Noiser is Metama. Chalev is not Metame. You kidding? From a behemoth. We're speaking about Isur Achila. That for a person to eat, and we're talking about not Chatzi Shir, whether it's Asur Meratoida or not, but for you to be punished, God forbid, for eating, you have to eat the amount of a Kazayas. I have a Kazayas of either Pigul or Noised or Chalev. And now it shrunk, and a person ate it. So it says the Mishnah, Harei Elu Tohoidim. That's step number 1. Yerushalmi Kimin Hagai has a step number 2. The step number 2 you have to read in the Marafulda. The Marafulda says, now the Mishnah writes another rule. Now we don't understand, is the other rule a continuation of this case or is it a new case? What's the other rule? The rule says, the Mishnah writes, I'm reading the words in the Marafulda from the Mishnah, that if something was left in rain, here you go, Kevan, not the fig. We're speaking about other foods. And now vinispachu, and now it became swollen. So now it's going to be metame. Or if you eat it, now kazayis, you're going to be chayiv the punishment. You know what's not clear in the Mishnah, Aviv? Is the case of it becoming swollen. Is it the case of the Reisha? It was a kazayis. It was a kebetza. It shrunk. Now it's back. Now you say that now it's can be metame because it was. Or maybe is the safe a new case. Even if I started out with something that was never a kebetza. It was never a kebetza. Now it got swollen with water. We don't view the water retention as two separate things. The water becomes part of the thing. Same thing by the fig. Now it's the size of a kebetza. In other words, and here we have a machloikas. And the Gemara says that din roimai, the chachamim from Daraim, we're south from what? From where you are. The Yerushalmi was put together in Sipairi, in Tiberia. All of the chachamim south of Tiberia are called already the southerners. The point of reference is not Yerushalayim. The point of reference is Tiberia, just to know by Yerushalmi. So the Chachamim of the south said, you know what the second case of the Mishnah is referring to? Only if something was originally a kazayis or a kebetza, and it shrunk, and now it got back, there is where you say, chayzer v'neir. But what are they basically saying? If the case of the Sefer, if you have food that was never in that size, even though now it, because of the rain, it got swollen up, they will not be metame. Why not? Why not? Because they are viewed based on their past. Who does it sound like? It sounds like Rabbi Yirmiyah, Gavaldik, Rabbi Yochanan and Shlakish that will continue tomorrow. They hold that no, even if it was never that size, if it got swollen, it's going to be metame. Why? Because they say when you look at something, you look at it and its potential future. So it already was always potentially that size. Now that it became that size, now it can be metame. Do you go back? Do you go forward? And lefu'ura, therefore, the machloikas between the Chachmei Daraim and Rabbi Yochanan and Shlakish is the same as the machloikas of Rabbi Yirmiyah and Rabbi Yoina and Rabbi Yosi. We'll leave it at that. This is great. When you look at the present, are you connecting it to the past? Are you connecting it to the future? And the Gemara is going to dismantle this association that we made today, which we will, God will,